beginning instead of committing to that zip-in, zip-out light footprint strategy, which had been the only way to sell a war without raising taxes and upsetting the folks at home, and which someone or other had described as just enough troops to lose. Not that political considerations were any of his concern, but now and then he couldn't help thinking, what the fuck? Whenever the door opened, a gust of wind puffed the cheeks of the tent in and out according to some geophysical rhythm, and still the colonel stood silently next to Miller, waiting while the men scraped into the chairs, some of them whistling and others laughing and punching each other on the arm. The ones who were sitting were banging their fists on the tables, and the latecomers, who had elbowed their way into the gaps between the tables in order to hear, were now pushing at one another and asking what was up before deciding it didn't matter. Just 2 more days and they'd be gone. Falwell thought how easy it would have been only a year before to bark out the facts and turn on his heel, but an unfamiliar wave of indecision washed over him, leaving him unsure of how to proceed. Sometimes he liked to shout out, "Terror and ecstasy!" at strategic places in his inspirational speeches. Even though the troops didn't know the words referred to Nietzsche's view that only by joyously affirming suffering could man transcend meaninglessness, and even though the colonel didn't know anything else about Nietzsche but that, it still felt good to say the words. Now he wanted to say something that would penetrate their thick, buzz-cut skulls and detonate their centers of understanding, but he didn't know what that something should be. Falwell appreciated that the male prefrontal cortex didn't mature until the mid to late 20s, which was why young, uneducated men made such good soldiers, and why college students like Falwell had once admired Nietzsche's early writings, and also why, at 47, he couldn't think of anything pertinent to say that would transcend the wide gulf that separated a man with a developed brain from a room full of men without. Men and women, he corrected himself. He didn't know much about women, and what he thought he knew was always turning out to be wrong. Just ask his ex-wife and his daughters how much he knew about women, and they would say, jack shit. His mouth was dry. His lips were cracked. His tongue felt like a hairless animal caught in a trap. Not to mention that lately he'd had a persistent, hacking cough that he should probably see a doctor for. "Fucking desert," he said to Miller, and Miller said, "Yes, sir," in that well-oiled, agreeable way he had. The noise in the DFAC was deafening. Even though some of the sound was absorbed by the soft canvas ceiling and the plywood floor that had been laid over the shifting desert sand, Miller had to shout to be heard. "At ease the noise!" he bellowed. One by one, the stragglers collapsed into the remaining chairs, or shuffled forward from the back of the room, or stood against the wall with their legs apart, increasingly alert to the long shadow of silence cast over the room by their commander. After a few seconds more, most of them had stopped pounding on the tables, and when Miller barked, "I said lock it up!" the last of them stopped talking too, until the only thing Falwell could hear was the flapping of the canvas roof, and, somewhere, a loose board banging in the wind. Even the tent seemed to be holding its breath and waiting for him to speak. Still, he gazed a fraction of a minute longer at his men, seeing in them his own youth, his own heedlessness, and also his own desperation to believe in something larger than himself. Finally, Falwell cleared his throat. He confined himself to pointing out that full participation in life involved disappointment and tragedy, and that the troops should enthusiastically embrace their lot, first because they were soldiers, and second because there wasn't any other choice. He added a few sentences from his center of gravity speech, which was loosely based on the theories of the great Prussian general and strategist Karl von Clausewitz. "Where the U.S. Army tends to conceive of the COG as the thing standing in the way of accomplishing a mission," he said, "I see it as an individual source of moral and physical strength. There's something every one of you is going to need." Then he bluntly announced that the tours were being extended. No exceptions. End of case. "I am headed to command headquarters this afternoon to receive new orders. I'll brief you again as